Hello everybody, welcome to the History Valley podcast with your host Jacob Berman. Today I'm joined by Jonathan Pearce, and today we're going to be talking about the resurrection. The book that we're going to be talking about, because he's published several books as a matter of fact, is primarily The Resurrection, a Critical Examination of the Easter Story. I'll have the Amazon page right on the screen here. I'll have the link in the description below. I'll also have a link to his Amazon page. He's also published several other books I just mentioned a moment ago. Books like Nativity, a Critical Examination, Why I Am an Atheist and Not a Theist, Beyond an Absence of Faith, The Little Book of Unholy Questions, and many more books, including books like Did God Create the Universe from Nothing? I'll have the Amazon page linked there, so you can go down there in the description, so you can go take a look. He's got many of his books on Kindle, paperback as well. So if you are a reader on the computer, you can do that. You can get it on Kindle. Or if you like paperback better, you can do that too. Or both.
Please, both.
All right. That being said, welcome to History Valley Podcast, Jonathan. So let's start off with my first question. When I was reading your book, one of the things you talked about is the guards at Jesus' tomb, which I thought to be an interesting discussion. And you concluded that it appeared to be that the guards are ahistorical. Could you explain to the audience why you don't think the guard story seems to be based on a reality?
I think the guard story, and by the way, thank you very much for inviting me on and for talking about those books, loads of books. Sure. That one, Universe from Nothing, is about the Kalam cosmological argument, which used to be a pretty big obsession of mine in the days of William Lane Craig being everywhere and the Kalam being one of his cornerstones. But interestingly, the other cornerstone is the religion, is the resurrection and the empty tomb. And to segue back to the idea of the guards at the tomb, I think it's a really interesting sort of area of the guards at the tomb, a little piece of the narrative, because I think it is not only is it clearly fiction, so it's a sort of, you could call it a legendary embellishment, but I think it's designed to do more than that. But it also shows the empty tomb narrative to be a later embellishment itself. So I'll hopefully I'll explain that to you. So let's go back to Mark. Mark is the earliest gospel source. In fact, if we go back earlier, we can talk about Paul. Paul doesn't mention anything to do with the empty tomb. That's very interesting in and of itself. And I would say this is a valid argument from silence. I'd say that we would expect him to say something about it, particularly in 1 Corinthians, where he's talking to the Corinthians about the resurrection and having an argument with them about the nature of the resurrection. You'd think this is a perfect time to bring into play notions or elements of the narrative, including the empty tomb. But he says nothing. He says nothing about any of the narrative at all. And that's really, really interesting. So that's interesting as a starter. And then we have this gap to Mark, and Mark interestingly ends his account pretty much at the empty tomb, with the woman going to the tomb and then running away and not telling anyone. And I think this is Mark's reason as to why he's the first person to tell you about the empty tomb, because I think he or his community or his sources are the people who have made up the empty tomb narrative. Does that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Yeah. So then we have, and the reason I think Mark's the first to make it up is because of Matthew's guards at the empty tomb, at the tomb. So then we have this gap between Mark and Matthew, which is a time period where Jews can hear or read Mark's account and produce a counter argument back to Mark saying, hang on, Jesus didn't resurrect. He is more likely the body was stolen. So Matthew is now the person who is presenting a counter argument back to the Jews, or a counter argument to the Jews' counter argument. So Matthew then says, okay, how do I solve this problem? How can I have a mechanism whereby it's clear that the body wasn't stolen? I'm going to have guards at the tomb. So Matthew then presents guards at the tomb that appear in no other gospel at all. Not in Luke, not in John, not in Mark, and obviously not in Paul. And I think the fact that Matthew is presenting a counter argument, or a counter argument to the Jews, and not Mark, is evidence that Mark was the one that created the empty tomb story in the first place. Because if Mark was the first person to create the empty tomb story, he would be, Mark was not the first person to create the empty tomb story, and it existed in the time of Paul, and Paul knew about it, as you would expect. If it actually happened, you would expect Paul to know about it, and you expect Paul to write about it, but he didn't. But had that been the case, Mark would have been the first person to present the counter argument with the guards at the empty tomb, or some other kind of mechanism. But Mark doesn't. Mark says, here's the empty tomb, some women ran away from it, and they never told anyone, which is in direct contradiction to Matthew, Luke, and John, where the women ran away and tell people straight away. So you've got an awful lot going on here. The fact that it appears in no other gospel, and you've got John and Luke, arguably, with regard to Luke, whether Luke was first or Matthew, different theories. But I would say Luke came after Matthew, and John certainly did. They do not mention the guards of the empty tomb. Why? So the question should always be, why is that the case? And it appears that it looks very much like it's a counter argument, and very much a mechanism of propaganda, perhaps, that they see maybe as too obviously so, and don't see it as necessary to include in their narrative. That's a broad overview. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, it does. And it kind of reminds me of Paul just randomly bringing up 500 witnesses in 1 Corinthians 15, and the Gospels end up not mentioning the 500 ever. And these 500 people are supposed to have been, to have seen they're supposed to have had a group sighting of the post-resurrection, the post-resurrected Christ. And he doesn't name any of them.
I mean, where to start here? So, with this Pauline, this is 1 Corinthians 15:6, where Paul basically says, and this is the entirety of the evidence for the appearance to 500 people plus, right? 500 plus people. So this is the entirety of the evidence. After that, he appeared to 500 brethren at one time. That's it. Now, I've watched apologists' videos and pastors talking in church and this and that on YouTube of people saying, this is evidence, this is eyewitness evidence of Jesus resurrecting. You're like, no, it's not. It is Paul making a claim in a letter that is not even a full sentence. It is a full sentence, sorry. After that, he appeared to 500 brethren at one time. That's a full sentence. It's one sentence in a letter that he's writing to the Corinthians. That is, A, Paul is not an eyewitness, and B, that's it. That's it. There's nothing. This is the lowest form of evidence you can possibly get. So I think there are four options going on here. First is Paul is lying. Still, I have no idea whether Paul is lying, but it's more probable than the Christian thesis. So we're talking about evaluating probability here. Is what's the most probable hypothesis to explain the data being this sentence.
Yeah.
So either Paul is lying. Second, Paul is mistaken, and we can split that into two parts. Paul is mistaken because his sources are lying, or his sources are mistaken, or Paul's words are a copyist error. And you could even say, you can split that into two. So maybe it's a copyist error, or copyist did that on purpose for some reason. So you've got all of those options are far more probable than the Christian than the Christian thesis. So when you're talking about justifying a belief, so say this glass here, right? This pint glass, that this is a justified belief, and I fill up my justified belief with two things: evidence and faith, right? In this case, I would say that one sentence is probably just a drop in here. And the rest has to be filled up with faith, because that claim alone, or you start having to fill it up with like other cumulative evidence from, I believe Paul because X, Y, and Z. But it comes down to the quality of this evidence in general and Paul in general. And of course, what do we know about Paul? Well, not really nearly enough to take that at face value as a true claim. So you just got to fill your glass up with faith. And I don't think that's a justified belief. And in fact, I think you can take this further, because I don't think you can ever get a justified belief, even if it did happen, from the writings of anyone at the time. I don't think they would ever justify belief in that, even if it was actually true. And I think that's the nature of doing history, is that when you have a miracle claim, in this case 2,000 years old, I don't think just by seeing different accounts you're ever justified in believing it, knowing what we know about the world and alternative hypotheses. I think there's always a more probable explanation.
So what do you think led up to, so after Jesus' crucifixion, what do you think caused people to start thinking that he rose from the dead?
To start faking that he rose from the dead?
Yeah.
Well, I'm not sure that there was faking. Well, actually, I don't know there wasn't. Right. So what are all the options? The options are people have hallucinations. It depends how you interpret even Paul's sort of visionary experiences. He talks about he gets revelation from scriptures and personal revelations, right? That's where he gets his information from, which is interesting in itself. That he put so much store in these kind of personal experiences. What was that? What was his road to Damascus experience? Was he seeing something that was a veridical experience, whereby if other people were there, they would see something as well? Or was it an internal experience? Was it a full-on just hallucination? Or was he struck by lightning? You know, light, sound, couldn't eat for 3 days. Could be struck by lightning. Do you know, all these are far more probable than the Christian explanation of the data. So then when you talk about all these other people, you've got to understand grief, anger, guilt, all these feelings. And you've got to understand the effect that death has on people. And you've got to understand cognitive dissonance reduction. So this is where you have expectations of, or a belief, and then you have evidence contrary to that belief. What does your brain do in order to usually maintain the core belief that you have? So how this contrary evidence, so in this case, it's Jesus is a Messiah, right? Jesus is a Messiah. I don't think they believed he was God. He's a Messiah. This is our idea of what a Messiah is, what a Messiah would do. Jesus goes to Jerusalem. He gets executed. Oh dear. My core evidence of Jesus is a Messiah. He's been executed. How do I harmonize these? And how do I deal with my grief and my anger and my guilt over the death and us running away and yada, yada, yada? This is perfect storm territory for people to have hallucinations. Now, when I used to think about the resurrection, I used to think visions and hallucinations was really like a bit of a cop-out route to take. I just found it quite unsatisfactory until I started doing research into how prevalent these kind of experiences are in these kind of contexts. And then it's like, okay, wow. And then if you go back in time into different cultures where you have far more superstition going on, then these are almost certainly going to happen. So you're going to have a mix of people having hallucinations that they'll interpret as veridical visions. You're going to have people probably lying as well, because you have a political situation where you have people vying for authority. What better way to get authority in the early church than to say, yeah, I've had a vision from I've seen Jesus. Jesus appeared to me. This is the sort of stuff that goes on politically within organizations, nascent cults like this. Totally understandable that happening, and lying, and cognitive dissonance reduction, your brain doing all sorts of funky stuff. So I think when you mix all of those sort of things together, what you get Paul reporting is kind of what you would expect. Now, whether Paul is reporting the truth or mistaken claims, or, you know, all these kind of different notions, is we just have to make inferences and we have to make probability evaluations. Past that, you know, we can't know anything with any kind of, well, we can't know anything with any certainty other than cogito ergo sum, right? I think, therefore I am. Past that, everything's a probability evaluation. This is no different. And we just need to look at, well, is it more likely that people lie, people have hallucinations, people, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Yes, all that's more likely than the Christian thesis.
Yeah, so some even think that Jesus' body being stolen, again, that's assuming he was buried, is what caused people to rise from to think he rose from the dead. One of the many explanations. I've also interviewed a couple of authors recently that think that Jesus actually survived the crucifixion, as you're familiar with, the Swoon hypothesis.
Yeah.
As a natural explanation for him having, for the claim that he arose from the dead, and typically they tend to think that Jesus was on drugs, and so it made it look like his body died, but it actually just temporarily, for like just a moment, shut down. And they'll often cite this passage somewhere in the Gospel of Mark, don't remember exactly where it is, in which Pilate was shocked how fast Jesus died on the cross. Then you get this guy called Joseph of Arimathea coming in, asking Pilate if he can have the body. Which is, I always thought that was peculiar, but more peculiar as I later when I later learned that that the Romans left their crucified victims on the cross to humiliate them, and that's something that Professor Bart Ehrman talks about when he.
So I think he's wrong. So I think I used to believe this as well. Well, so there is. Okay, what's going on? The truth is, Romans left their crucified criminals on a cross as a deterrent. Mm-hmm. Yep, that's true. That happened all across the Roman Empire. However, it is almost certainly not the case that happened in Judea, because the Jewish people had a treaty with the Romans, where the Romans allowed them a lot of elbow room for exercising their own religious rules and customs. One of which is that bodies have to be taken down from the post, from the wood, before sunset, because it then otherwise it breaks sort of rabbinic laws and so on and so forth. So I used to believe what Bart Ehrman believed until actually Richard Carrier convinced me otherwise. We had extended conversations about this, and he's absolutely right that there is absolutely loads of evidence from the Mishnah and other rabbinic writings that this is what would have happened. It is a really bad thing in kind of Jewish custom to leave a body up after sunset. So I believe I think you can argue that Mark's Joseph of Arimathea was a pious Jew, not a secret follower. The secret follower thing is a later embellishment from the other Gospels, but Mark, you can interpret him as not a secret follower of Jesus, but as a pious Jew taking down a body. And then you could. Well, I think the most likely thing is he was actually stoned to death and never crucified anyway. He was stoned to death and then buried in a criminal's graveyard. And this whole thing is just like a made-up narrative to fit loads of Old Testament prophecies. I say that very loosely because they're not prophetic. They're just cherry-picked verses. So I think that's what happened, and the rest is kind of embellished and made up. But if you think he was crucified, it is at least plausible that a pious Jew would take his body down to get it buried, and then even this is a plausible explanation that buried temporarily because he's got to get it done quickly because it's holy days and festivities and this buries him in a tomb, but you can't bury the criminal next to the righteous because it defiles the ground. So then perhaps he comes back later, moves the body when he can to a criminal's graveyard. But the followers of Jesus think he's buried in that original tomb. Go back to that tomb, he's not there. Hence, you get an empty tomb. That's plausible, far more plausible than Christian thesis.
Yeah, that's why I wanted to ask you about that, because I was going to say that there was like I know that there were some issues with what Bart Ehrman said, and I'm glad you brought that stuff up. Yeah, that's why I brought up his claim that Jesus was left on the cross.
Yeah, and it's really common. Like people like John Dominic Crossan, they often, his body would have been left to be picked at by wild carrion, and I just don't think that would have happened in that area of the Roman Empire. Sorry, carry on.
Oh no, all good. Yeah, the other thing that's interesting to me is who is Jesus' parents, because is it God directly, or is it the Holy Spirit and Mary, God and Mary, or somehow Jesus himself and Mary, because Jesus is God, so I guess he's his own dad. Because he talked about the Trinity. Yeah, it definitely made me laugh when I thought about that. You talked about the Trinity a few times in your book, and I've often wondered if one of the reasons why the Trinity doctrine was even created originally was to solve the gospel contradictions of Jesus' divine origins. Like, is he the Son of the Holy Spirit and Mary, God and Mary, himself and Mary?
I think the whole thing is a hot mess.
Yeah.
It's about the best description. Let's go back to the parent thing, because before we go on to the Holy Trinity, I think it's really interesting to note that Joseph and Mary are his parents, right? But they don't seem to appear much at his death. Or Joseph is certainly absent. What else do we have in the Gospels, particularly Mark, is the motif of reversal of expectation. That's where you expect certain people to come through and be good, like the disciples. They're supposed to be like the followers of Jesus and the heroes, if you like. What happens is they deny Jesus, run away. They have nothing to do with his death at all. Who are the people who are around at Jesus' death? Mary Magdalene, right? Okay, so is this a new version of Mary the mother? Yes, could well be. Who's the other person around? Joseph of Arimathea. And I know some people contest this, but Richard Carrier's analysis of Arimathea is arguably that it means best disciple town. So if Joseph of best disciple town is coming and being the savior of Jesus' death and giving him an honorable burial, which is what his father should be doing, or should be at the death and burial, but he's nowhere to be seen, and the other person is Mary Magdalene instead of Mary, his mother, then we have a really interesting reversal of expectation motif. And instead of Simon Peter, we have Simon Cyrene coming off the fields to help him carry his cross. So there are all these little nuggets that come in to make you think there's theology going on here, there's symbolism going on here, but it's not fact. There's an awful lot happening. As far as a Trinity is concerned, I don't think any Trinitarian theory I've ever read makes any sense. Right. And I think, but it's interesting because I think Matthew, Mark, and Luke, I don't think believe Jesus is divine, as in God. I think they think he's an exalted divine Messiah figure. And it's only from John onwards that you start getting a development of Jesus being actual God. And it's very clear from the beginning of John. And then through the early church fathers up to sort of councils and whatnot, you start getting this development of a Trinitarian doctrine that then gets sort of cemented into orthodoxy.
It looks like to me they're trying to make Jesus, or John that is trying to make Jesus God, probably because he was looking at the theology of the previous Gospels. He felt it necessary to say that Jesus is God himself. Jesus is God the Father, John 10:30. Because he thought the miracles of Jesus, to him, made it look like he's another God. And he can't be another God because in his eyes, he's a monotheist. There's only one God. So he solves the problem by creating another problem that somehow Jesus is his own dad. Yeah, that always made me giggle thinking about that.
There's just no way of making sense of the Holy Trinity in and of itself. But then when you start looking particularly at the synoptic gospels, your Mark, Matthew, and Luke, when you start seeing that Jesus is praying to himself on the cross, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? That makes absolutely no sense of the Holy Trinity. There's just no way. And I know, Christians will sort of mentally contort and try and present something that is just, I'm sorry, it's not convincing for me. So John, on the other hand, has a narrative that is more aligned to a Trinitarian doctrine, but the synoptics most certainly aren't. And you get this sort of bizarre set of things happening where it appears that Jesus is clearly not God, saying things that are clearly not aligned with Trinitarian doctrine.
And you talk about another thing you talk about in your book, and you mentioned this a couple of times. You talk about the last Adam, or the second Adam theology. Jesus is called the second Adam, which is something that I've been very interested in lately. I've always wondered, because the second Adam is actually mentioned, the last Adam is actually mentioned in some Jewish apocrypha, like third Baruch, because in third Baruch, the first Adam is called the first Adam, which insinuates that the author thinks it was a second Adam, because I don't recall the author actually directly mentioning a second Adam, but he called Adam the first Adam. So there you go. And I've wondered, why does Paul call Jesus the second Adam?
Well, and then you've got in the genealogies, of course, the importance of linking Jesus to Adam, but then of course the further problems that if Jesus doesn't have a like biological father, then that's all kind of pointless anyway. But you've got the desire to link Jesus with with Judaism. I mean, from Matthew, for example, Jesus is the new Moses. Okay, so and the Gospel of Matthew, the events of Jesus' life that take place look rather like reworkings of the life of Moses. So Jesus goes up a hill and delivers commandments type thing, so on and so forth. So I think what Paul is doing, although a lot of the time he's speaking to Gentiles where it's not so important, but there is this, you have this argument within the early church where Paul is differing from Peter and James, etc., about how Jewish, Paul is taken to task for not being Jewish enough. And so I think there are all these different tensions going on where, on one side of things, he's trying to make Jesus this kind of Jewish thing. And on the other hand, he's trying to distance himself from Judaism to appeal to the Gentile communities. So I don't know. A lot of waffling.
And it looks to me from what I'm seeing, the reason why he's calling him, the reason why I think Paul called him the second Adam, is because he's trying to portray Jesus as some sort of, because in the New Testament, as everybody knows, Jesus is supposed to be the guy that ushers in a new covenant.
Yeah.
And so the second Adam is like a way of expressing that Jesus did something that spiritually reset, not literally like this, but sort of reset to the beginning, a new beginning.
Yeah.
So he becomes another Adam.
Yeah, and I think for Paul, he again, I don't think he sees Jesus as God.
Right.
So I think I would align with Bart Ehrman in How Jesus Became God, which is a really good book. But he talks about, this exalted. Well, so Paul thinks of Jesus as this exalted divine figure, but not a God figure, and it's that kind of lower Christology that Paul is advocating, and I think the Synoptic Gospels continue that tradition, as I said, until John changes to a higher Christology. And I think you can see a second Adam in that context, with obviously Adam being a human at the end of the day, and it's much more an earthly kind of configuration of like his idea of who Jesus is as a divine human. But yeah.
You also talk about in your book when you're citing Dr. Richard Carrier in page 126, chapter The Spiritual Body of Christ and the Legend of the Empty Tomb, Price and Lauder, 2005. You're bringing up that there's an argument that Paul had seen a spiritual resurrection. It was all... Basically, this goes back to what you were saying earlier, that they were having visions. And it was these visions that made them think that Jesus rose from the dead.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you're going to be a really disappointed and angry and guilty follower of Jesus, and you go to a tomb, imagine, well, it depends what theory of what you think happened. But either it was made up out of whole cloth, but you're still going to get a disappointment. Because I still think, as a historicist, I still think Jesus went to Jerusalem and was crucified. Mm-hmm. Whether it was for sedition or whether it was for high treason is kind of unknowable. But he was probably almost certainly crucified, or very probably, executed. But I think he is probably stoned and then buried in a criminal's graveyard. But you're still going to get this kind of disappointment of the followers thinking why he's a Messiah. And we know from cognitive dissonance theories, so the work of Leon Festinger in the 60s, where him and a few psychoanalysts infiltrated a UFO cult, and they were going to have this rapture day, and they all to be in a certain place and get taken up and be the ones saved by these alien spacecraft, and it never happened. So, but instead of like running away from that cult and saying, well, it's a load of rubbish, so we were wrong, they are like, they had the cognitive dissonance reduction. So how do we reduce this disharmony that's going on? And they just reinterpreted. We got the date wrong, or we got this wrong, and then they kind of did another date, and that failed as well. But it's this constant kind of, we can't be wrong, our core beliefs can't be wrong, so our brains will do funky stuff. So this is exactly what's going on with the disciples, which is, well, he's still got to be the Messiah, so something else must be going on. And then in all that disappointment, somebody has some kind of hallucination or some kind of experience where they feel they see Jesus resurrected, and then they're like, okay, and out of this, and then other people are like, and then they're going to be more susceptible to have similar experiences, so on and so forth, or they simply make stuff up because it's politically expedient to do so. And here we have this new belief coming out of that, and I think that's what's going on here. As far as what Paul believed about the resurrection itself, I think he actually believed in a spiritual transformation to a spiritual body from the real body, so he wouldn't have had an empty tomb anyway. And there's a big chapter in there that I talk about. I think that might be what you're referring to, which is where Paul believes in a two-body resurrection, whereas the Gospels, I think, are arguing against Paul and Gnostic belief, which is a full-on spiritual resurrection. The Gospels are very much on a resuscitated, reanimated corpse resurrection. hence the empty tomb. I don't think Paul could have had an empty tomb in his narrative, because there would have been a body there, because he believed, I argue, that there is a transformation of that body, but with the body remaining there, into a spiritual body, and that is what resurrects and appears, but leaving that corporeal entity still in place. And then, of course, like, to go back to the appearance of the 500, in the appendix to my book, I talk about how, we talked earlier about how it could be Paul lying, Paul being mistaken, his sources lying, his sources being mistaken, or there being a copyist error or copyist interpolation. And all of those are far more probable. But I did, in my appendix, I do note some of it is actually another essay from Carrier, where he says that the appearance to the 500 is well, I'll read you if I may. So shortly after listing the appearance sequence, Paul writes, Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep. What 1 Corinthians 15:20. The first fruits is a reference to the Pentecost ritual of offering the first fruits of the harvest to God, per Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It seems a remarkable coincidence that Paul said the risen Jesus was akin to the Pentecost offering in the same place he mentions an appearance to over 100 all at once, and Acts narrates an appearance to over 100 on Pentecost when they were all together in one place, Acts 2:1. Might Paul's letter have originally read, and here he does a bit of Greek analysis, epipentekostes adelphois, rather than epano pentakosiosis adelphois, excuse me for butchering that, that would have meant Paul said Jesus appeared, quote, during the Pentecost to the brethren. So instead of appearing to the 500, he's actually appearing at the Pentecost. So this isn't what Paul's doing in listing, because he doesn't mention the Pentecost at all, is actually not appearing to the 500. Paul is saying just this is the Pentecost appearance. That so in other words, he didn't say how many brethren there were, only that the brethren all experienced a vision at the Pentecost. This would explain where the author of Acts 2 got the idea for a mass vision of the brethren on Pentecost. So on and so forth. And he goes through and he actually analyzes the language used there, saying that, the spelling is even weirdly close. Acts says that the event happened, and then he talks about how the Pentecost, the words are just really, really similar. So it could easily be a copyist error or just a little interpolation to change things, such that is far more probable than Jesus appeared to the 500, for which we have no other evidence. Would you believe anything? I mean, if I said to you now, I jumped over the chestnut tree out my front garden, out across the road from me yesterday, I jumped over this 30-foot, 40-foot tree, and I just jumped over it. 500 people saw me. Just because I told you that 500 people saw me, that's not good quality evidence for the belief or for the assent to the truth of that proposition that I jumped over the tree. Just it's not good enough. It's not good enough. But like I said earlier, I don't think anything that Paul could have said would have been good enough, because I don't think you can rationally believe such crazy miracles based on that kind of testimony.
So you think, as Dr. Currier thinks, if I'm understanding this correctly, that the 500 were not originally there, that just later ended up there due to some sort of either copyist error, interpolation, or misinterpretation?
Yeah, I think that list that he gives, Cephas the 12, 500, is actually Cephas the 12, Pentecost, etc., etc., etc. Then, of course, you still have to explain the Pentecost appearance, but that's more of an experience. That's more of a Pentecostal church kind of experience, which we see nowadays. People having these like glossolalia and these speaking in tongues. Like, do we believe that every Pentecostal church every Sunday in America is genuinely having those experiences, veridical experiences of the Holy Spirit? And do we think they're genuinely speaking in tongues? No, we don't. Like, that's clearly nonsense, right? I'm sorry. In fact, half of Christendom doesn't believe that. I can tell you most C of E, Church of England Christians in the UK, which is real nominal, soft Christianity, will think that's nonsense, right? So that ain't happening there. So when we then look back at the original sort of Pentecostal experience of the Holy Spirit, did that happen? No. I mean, I would need way better evidence than the claims in Acts to believe that that took place. But I think that's what Paul is listing. But even if he's not, he's listing appearance to 500, which is incorrect because it never happened.
Why do you think, in your opinion, that the Matthew's Gospel wrote about the Magi coming to see Jesus? And before you answer, I want to throw something else in here. There's a claim that's been going around. Many authors have brought this up, and scholars too, that the Magi story in Matthew's Gospel could have originated from the story that Josephus told, that the Magi went to go see Emperor Nero. So what do you think about all that?
I love that. So just to spam you again, I've written a book, The Nativity, a Critical Examination, which is a lot thinner than my Resurrection one, but that talks a lot about this. There's even there's a visit of King Tiridates, is it, and some Magi that was to do at the same time as I think it might have even been Halley's Comet. And that happened, I think, in 68 CE. So Matthew would have known about this. So was he taking that motif and weaving it into his story? But here's the thing about the Magi, right? They are merely and very obviously a mechanism to get Herod involved in the story. The reason he wants Herod involved in the story is because, like I told you earlier, Matthew is his audience of Jews. So he wants to appeal to his Jewish audience, and which means he has to make Jesus the ultimate Jew. So who is the ultimate Jew? Moses. So Jesus has to be a better Moses. So whatever Moses did, Jesus has to do it +1, right? So with Moses, you had the death of the firstborn and the Pharaoh. Who can be the bad guy that represents a Pharaoh? King Herod. He fits the mold pretty well because he's a pretty nasty figure. How do I get Herod? So Matthew's problem is we know Jesus as Jesus of Nazareth. Nazareth is up here, Bethlehem's down here. How do I get Jesus of Nazareth to Bethlehem? Well, he has a completely different way of doing this to Luke. Luke has Jesus or Mary and Joseph living in Nazareth and has a census taking place where they have to go weirdly to a different tax area to Bethlehem for the census. Matthew, on the other hand, that happens in 6 CE. That's the census of Quirinius. That happens in 6 CE. Matthew, on the other hand, has Herod being alive, and he dies in 4 BCE or 5 BCE. So there's at least a 10, 11-year gap between these two stories. They cannot be consistent with each other. It's impossible. But Matthew has him born in Bethlehem. So Bethlehem, Jerusalem. How do we get Herod, the Pharaoh, involved in this story? So what Matthew does is he has a Magi who are not appearing in Luke at all, and he has them following a star. And there's also reference to Balaam and Balak and Nebuchadnezzar and et cetera, et cetera. So Daniel, there's loads of Old Testament theology being wrapped up with the Magi. So he has them following a star, but that star weirdly takes them to Jerusalem and not straight to Bethlehem. And then the star gets lost in Jerusalem. Bear in mind, this is a supernatural star that God controls. So remember this, because it's God that leads them to Jerusalem. So, and the only reason that they get lost in Jerusalem is so that Matthew can have them walk around Jerusalem going, where's the king, where's the king? And Herod going, hang on, what's going on here? And get involved in the story. But weirdly, Matthew does, well, not weirdly, you completely understand because he wants Jesus to escape, but he doesn't have Herod following the Magi. He has him going, oh, Magi, when you find Jesus, come back and tell us where he lives. And then I'll go down and give him some praise. Brackets, kill him. So what happens is they then pick up the star again and they go down to Bethlehem. And here's this is why you know it's a complete mechanism, right? Before they go back to see Herod to tell him where Jesus is born, they have a dream sequence that warns them not to go back to Herod because he's a bad guy. So then they leave and go back home a different direction, right? A different route. Why did they not have that dream sequence before they got to Jerusalem? Why did the star not lead them straight to Bethlehem? And why did they not have a dream sequence before they got to Jerusalem saying, don't say anything to Herod? Because, of course, then Herod wouldn't be involved. So this is all just a mechanism to get Herod involved. And then what does Herod do? He slaughters the innocent like the firstborn. Jesus and family run away to Egypt for a couple of years until they come out of Egypt. Out of Egypt, I will call my son Israel. So they're fulfilling, this is Matthew fulfilling Moses prophecy, or whatever, fulfilling this kind of Moses trope, coming out of Egypt and then resettling back in Nazareth. That's a lot of talk to just explain that Matthew's Magi are merely a mechanism to, one, show that Jesus trumps Zoroastrianism, because you've got high, important wise men from the Zoroastrian sort of area and religion coming and kneeling down and giving gifts to Jesus. They are also representing certain elements of the Old Testament, like Daniel and Balaam and Balak and so on and so forth. And they also get Herod involved to become the new Pharaoh. And they also allow Jesus to be chased out to Egypt so he can come out of Egypt and fulfill the prophecy that out of Egypt I will call my son Israel. But they didn't exist. Because you can't follow a star to a house.
Right, that is silly. So it looks like, just as you were just saying a moment ago, they're trying to make Jesus bigger than Moses, but not bigger and better than not just bigger and better than Moses, but also other Old Testament prophets too, like Elisha. He feeds the multitude, and Jesus does the same thing. He feeds the multitude, splitting bread and fish for thousands, and from only a handful, less than a handful of them. And Elisha does something very similar. I think it's just bread in the Old Testament, if I remember correctly. But he did feed multitudes of only like less than a handful of it.
I think it's fairly clear that most of what Jesus does in his life are just reworkings of Old Testament ideas, stories, narratives, tropes, whatever. And I think, even the ascension, who's at the ascension with him, is about like Jesus really being seen as better than all of them. As you say, whether it be Moses or any of the prophets, Jesus is brinkmanship. He's one up than all of them.
And even with Adam, because he's called the second Adam, he rises from the dead, supposedly rises from the dead, and he releases the sin of all of humanity. Whereas the first Adam screws up, and his first act of sin causes humanity to inherit sin from him. And he doesn't rise from the dead and correct his mistake, but Jesus does.
It's brilliant, yeah. And you can, like you said earlier, kind of spiritual reset. I think that's a really good way of seeing it. I think imagine you were to sit down, right, in a Jewish context, you are a follower of Jesus, right, and you believe he's the Messiah, and you've got a blank slate with Jesus, but it's not a blank slate, because you're going to say, right, how can I make Jesus like awesome? If I want to go out and proclaim the awesomeness of Jesus, what would I want to be saying? So you look back at, and this is exactly what happens. It might not have been as deliberate of this in the sense of getting together and having a brainstorming session, but it's like, right, we've got Adam, we've got Moses, we've got Elijah, all, you name them all, right? What did they do? What do we know they did? What do they represent? Right, Jesus has to be better than all of these. So how can we adapt these stories and give them a new Jesus spin? And this is kind of almost like the rabbinic tradition of Pesher, which is where you are kind of like reworking stories to a more current like form for a present audience, and it gives it new meaning and new currency. So I think it is clearly what's going on with the New Testament Gospels.
So if you had to pick the reason why Jesus was crucified, what do you think is the most likely reason, in your opinion, about why he was executed? that you can think of?
Well, it's one of two. He either just annoyed the um, the Sanhedrin, so the sort of Jewish religious powers in Jerusalem. So he goes there and starts preaching stuff. Maybe he did even go to the temple and overturn. Maybe he was a bit of a revolutionary preacher, right? Which is all very interesting when you start getting the prosperity gospel people of the modern era. Jesus isn't actually, the sort of Jesus you want him to be. But I think it's more likely he was some kind of revolutionary preacher, went into Jerusalem and claimed that, or had his followers claim that he was, the king of the Jews in some sense. That was interpreted by the Sanhedrin really badly, and they had him executed. Or he was claiming he was the king of the Jews, and the Romans had him executed for sedition because no one could be the king, and that's genuinely would be something that would annoy Roman authorities, specifically in this kind of era part of the world where they're having a few issues with upstarts and whatnot. So I think the sedition argument is pretty good, but what then becomes interesting to think about is, well, if it was sedition, why does that not feature in the Gospels? Why do they go out of their way to make sure that the Romans are off the hook and it's the Jews that are blamed? Yeah, because when we have the, who shall I let go? So you have Pontius Pilate giving the Jewish crowds a chance to let Jesus go. This is the Romans saying, I will happily let him go, and it's a Jewish crowd going, no, let Jesus Barabbas go, but not Jesus the Christ. Why is that? So then you go, well, could it be because actually at the time of writing the Gospels, they are trying to spread this news to the Roman Empire and the Gentiles, apart from, say, Matthew, maybe, but a lot of the Gentile audience are Roman citizens or members of the Roman Empire. If you're going to be blaming the Romans for killing Jesus, that's a bad move. So we want to differentiate ourselves from Judaism. We want to bring on Gentiles and also say we're not just Judaism 2.0. We are a new thing. We're this new kind of cult, sect, belief, religion, whatever. And so it's distancing themselves from Judaism, so they can do that by blaming the Jews for Jesus' death, whilst also exonerating any kind of Roman involvement. And I think that's a really neat political move. Whether it plays more into the hands that the Romans killed him or that the Jews killed him, I don't know. I'm not happy. Do you know what I mean? Either's plausible. But I think it's always interesting to think about these ideas within the context. Sometimes we divorce the decisions and the ideas about what they were writing from literally from the historical context in which they're written. So what would people be trying to do at this time? How would they be trying to evangelize? What are they doing on a daily basis? They are going and trying to convince people to believe stuff, to believe this thing. How am I best going to do that? What's the best content and tactics I can use to achieve that?
Yeah, that makes sense. This kind of reminds me somewhat of Professor Dennis MacDonald's conclusions that Jesus was a Torah reformer, and he got into a confrontation with the Jews, several of them, and he ended up getting executed for that reason. His argument goes something along those lines, and that actually takes me. You can comment on that if you want.
Well, yeah, I think that's really plausible, especially when you start looking at Paul, and it depends what you believe about Paul, right? Mm-hmm. Going on from right, how much did he persecute the Christians? How much of that is true? How much of that is a bit of exaggeration? So on and so forth. So you've got to take everything with a bit of a pinch of salt. But if if we're to believe that fairly genuinely, then Jews are annoyed with Christians, right, and with this kind of reformist movement, and you could imagine that being something they've always been annoyed with, even when Jesus was alive and saying whatever he might have been saying. Because I think, I mean, another great Bart Ehrman book is Jesus Before the Gospels. I keep talking about this in the talks I give. It's a really, really very good book, but it talks about like gist memories. So what are these ideas of Jesus that were probably true? And there were probably some sayings that were true because they're littered multiply throughout the Gospels. And he's probably went to Jerusalem and was executed. And he's probably annoyed the Jewish authorities. So these sort of things are there's got a high probability of being true, and you can map that onto sort of Paul's missionary work afterwards and his conversion after persecuting the Christians in the same way you can imagine Jesus would have been persecuted when he was alive, or at least annoying people such that they ended up executing him.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and that takes me to the Talmud, because I know this is a very hotly debated topic, if Jesus is mentioned or not in the Talmud, but there's a Jesus in there, as I'm sure you are aware, who was executed by the Sanhedrin for heresy against Judaism, and I think there are contradicting accounts. I think one says he was stoned, and the other, well, he was hung on a tree. But there are different Jesuses in the Talmud. That kind of depends if they are to be identified as the same Jesus or not, and so there are different arguments for all that. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, the Talmud generally written later, as understood, and so therefore, is it a response to claims of Jesus, so that it's almost taking the idea of Jesus's birth and death and playing around with those ideas and making fun of them? I'm no Talmud expert, though. I think I do mention it in my book somewhere. But yeah, I would admit I'm no expert on the Talmud, but I think, the fact that it is written later means that it's always about what is the author trying to say here. What are these people trying to do with their claims? Are they reporting things as some kind of history? No, not really. So there's probably something else going on. What are your thoughts?
Well, the way I look at it, so if we have a mention of Jesus in the Talmud, it's probably the character called Jesus, son of Pantera, because to me it looks like the Talmudic Jesus, son of Pantera is derived from Celsus's Jesus, son of Pantera, and the argument that Origen, in Origen's response, he called out contra Celsus contra Celsus against Celsus, and it makes some very strange claims that Jesus' real father was actually a Roman soldier.
Yeah.
And I actually interviewed Professor Tabor on that, because I was curious about that. I wanted to get him on the show. He came on the show, and we talked. We had a long conversation about that, and he. From what I remember from the conversation, he says that he thinks that Pantera was a Jew, but not a Roman soldier. That's he said something like that. He thinks the Roman soldier part was added in later, probably by Celsus. That's how his argument pretty much goes, something like that. But at the same time, as he also acknowledges, Celsus is writing very late, somewhere in the, I think it was 180s, 170s, the earliest that CE that he was writing his work, and what's interesting is he found this. He didn't find this. Excuse me. But he went to a site, a museum in Germany, and there's this statue, sort of, a gravestone, excuse me, of a Roman soldier called Tiberius Julius Abdus Pantera. He talks about that. And he said that Abdus is a Hebrew word, and that's an indicator that this Roman soldier was actually a Jew serving in the army, from what I remember from his argument. And the point he's making is that this is evidence that Pantera, well, one of his many pieces of evidence, that Pantera is a name circulating in first century Judea, before, during, and after the time of Jesus. And he talked about other ossuaries using that name too. I find his argument to be interesting, because if it's true, then I guess what Celsus did is either he was lying, which Origen thought he was lying, and I guess one way he could have lied, or he could interpret it as a mistake. Kind of reminds me of what you were talking about, Paul, earlier about the 500. In different ways you can look at that. One can look at that. He could have conflated two Panteras together, maybe even that specific Roman soldier. Who knows? Hard to tell.
I think those theories are eminently plausible, because it comes down to the fact that almost any naturalistic theory is more plausible than a supernaturalistic theory, especially of the extraordinary nature of the Christian ones, right? So, and just to, most of your viewers will know this, but Celsus was a kind of Jewish polemicist who was criticizing Christianity and the Christian claims, but unfortunately we don't have any primary sources for his criticisms. We only know about what he believed and what he said through the work of Origen in Contra Celsus. So he is presenting arguments back against, Celsus, and this idea, which is a really interesting theory, which is eminently plausible, again, as I say, because imagine Joseph, right, bless his cotton socks. Joseph gets home from a hard day's carpentry, hard day's tecton working, and he and Mary says, "Oh, by the way, I'm pregnant," and he's like, "What?" And she's like, "Don't worry, it was God." "Oh, that's fine. That's fine." You're like, seriously? Like, everyone in town's going to be thinking, "No, it wasn't God." Well, if it's not God, who was it? And this soldier is as good an option as any that you could offer. I mean, you see all these memes about Mary doing pregnancy tests and wondering who, trying to get. But as funny as they are naturally what the reactions would be. It sounds like funny, but at the end of the day, it depends how much truth that you think there is to Jesus's parents, right, and the claims about them. So I would say the nativity accounts never happened, but I think you've got a problem that Jesus is known as Jesus of Nazareth, and you have this problem that when you trawl back through the Bible, and I think this is actually an incorrectly interpreted prophecy, they think he's got to come from Bethlehem. So the two Gospels that present the birth narratives, as I said before, get him from Bethlehem back to Nazareth in their own ways. Actually, I don't think he needs to be born in Bethlehem. He just needs to come from the clan of the family of the Bethlehemites. But anyway, that's another thing. So how much do we really know about Jesus's parents? Not a lot. So is that kind of virgin birth story completely made up, as in, and again, it's one-upmanship. You've got Caesar Augustus. Jesus is competing with Caesar Augustus and all the other divine or awesome human birth stories around. Jesus has to be at least as good as them. So it has to be a miraculous birth. So whether it was just completely made up, and then later, the Jews come back with, well, if it was a virgin birth, we think it was actually blah, 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 and come up with the counter argument, or whether this was somebody knew some kind of story about Mary claiming it was like God, and then that counter argument existed right from the beginning. It's a complete unknown, but basically that kind of birth story never happened, and something like Pantera, from which the Brazilian metal band get their name, is a plausible explanation.
So, in conclusion, to this discussion on the resurrection, what do you think? And I think I probably asked this already earlier, but either way, in conclusion to the discussion, what do you think is the most probable detailed reason that actually caused, what led up to them, to the followers of Jesus, to think he rose from the dead? And I'm not talking about just the visions. What led up to them? What do you think led up to them even having visions in this scenario? A psychological analysis, just throw everything at it.
Well, I suppose so. So, if your initial belief is that my cult leader is the Messiah, so imagine what you would do. Imagine what you would feel like, right? I believe that Jesus, this guy here, is the Messiah. I believe he's a really charismatic leader, and he's taken me along with him, and I've been following him, and I think he's amazing, and he is the Messiah, and he's going to take on maybe even the Roman Empire. Maybe even he's going to free us from the shackles of the Roman oppression. And then I'm going to follow him to Jerusalem, and then he's executed. Oh. So I literally only have two options. One, I was wrong. Two, I was right. That's the only options you've really got. So if I was wrong, then I'm going to have to admit that I was duped somehow, and that I was investing all this time and effort into something that was a fraud, and I've been had. Or he's still the Messiah. How do I make him the Messiah? How can he still maintain being the Messiah? And this is a case of looking back through the Old Testament, seeing how can you have a dying Messiah? How can you have a sacrificial form of Messiah? So straight away, people would have had confusion and stuff, because they wouldn't have understood what's going on. And then you have people saying, well, he's still the Messiah. How can he be the Messiah? And they'll be talking and discussing, and then one or two of them be having like hallucinations or visions of Jesus. And then so this is not the end. And then it's a case of, how do we develop a narrative? How do we understand this? It's not like they're going to sit down and say, how do we fool ourselves into believing this narrative, right? Or people don't work like that, I don't think. I think there would have been genuine belief, at least for many of them, that he was still the Messiah. And so it wasn't like, let's perpetuate a fraud that we are going to fool other people with. I don't think that's what happened. But I think it's like a genuine misunderstanding of all the data that's going on. And then looking back at the Hebrew Bible and trying to understand what's happened in terms of scriptures, and then developing ideas. And this is just an ongoing development. So you've got, as I said earlier, schisms in the early church. But again, that's 15, 20 years later, when Paul is having theological wrangles about how different from Judaism this movement should be, with all the other early followers. But in that period, at the end of the day, we have seen other movements in history where people have been claimed to be messiahs. You can look at Waco, you can look at all, Jim Jones, you can look at all these different like cults that have existed. You can go back to Sabbatai. In my book, I talk quite a lot about Sabbatai Zavi, who's this I think 16th century Jewish messiah figure who becomes an apostate and joins Islam, and all his followers have cognitive dissonance, and it's so many amazing parallels. And then you start getting these miracle claims, and you get Nathan, his trusted confidant and an accomplice, writing letters talking about these miracles, about the prophets, visions with the prophets, and sightings in cities and stuff like this. Oh my goodness, this is a massively interesting parallel. But Christians don't believe that. None of us believe. You and I don't believe those kinds about sabotage happening. But what it does is it tells you how a movement like Christianity could begin, how any such movement begins, because we don't believe in the truth claims of any of those movements throughout time and history. And yet there are movements of people who believe real living human beings are some kind of divine or special person. And false stories come out about them. So Jim Jones, I think there's a story about Jim Jones walking on water. And his acolytes woke up bleary-eyed one morning, and they saw him just coming out of the surf, I think, and it looked like to them like he was walking on water. And out of that, the story of Jim Jones walking on water was born. And you're like, these things, it doesn't take an awful lot of imagination even to understand how these things can start coming about. If you really believe someone is special, you start reinterpreting an awful lot of your memories of them, but also the things that happen in terms of that specialness you believe of him or her or whatever. So I think he was executed. He was probably almost certainly buried in a criminal's graveyard. Whether there was an empty tomb involved, I doubt it, but there are plausible hypotheses where that could be the case. Of a moved body and followers going back to the tomb and it being empty, and then going, oh my goodness, Jesus is resurrected. And then out of that, any hallucination or experience you have is Jesus resurrecting. But you've also got to start looking at the stories like the road to Emmaus, right, in Luke, this resurrection story, where these two guys don't recognize Jesus, even though they know him. And they're walking along with him and he's telling stories, and they don't recognize until they get him in the house and he sits down, he breaks bread with them. So this to me tells you, like, you will recognize Jesus when you break bread. This is a kind of Eucharistic kind of like story. This is theology, not history. The whole of my book, I talk about it's theology, not history. So even the stories that are presented in the New Testament Gospels of resurrection appearances are clearly not veridical experiences. They are made up. That is theology. There's no way you would walk down a road for all that time with someone that you knew and not recognize them until they broke some bread. It just ain't happening. So that's theology. And you'll find that most of the narratives of theology, and so trying to then pair that away to find out really what's the historical truth under it, if any of it is difficult. But I think you'll find that almost none of it is historical. But then the question is, how does that belief generate?
Yeah.
But I think that's your skeleton, and then you can flesh that out with a lot of psychology, and then a lot of politics, a lot of potentially lying or misunderstanding, and then eventually, because when you start getting the Gospels being written later, none of them are eyewitnesses. So they're just layering on this embellishment after embellishment after embellishment. And I think none of that, they would have been evangelized to in another place, Antioch or somewhere else. You've got churches spreading up here, and they're just delivering stories about Jesus to other people orally, with no interest in 100% historical accuracy going on. Like when I tell you, Jacob, a story about Jesus that I've experienced and you've never heard of Jesus, I'm telling you all this stuff. I don't then ask, Jacob, can you just repeat that back to me? So I just made sure you got 100% of what I told you correct. And can you then repeat it 5 times so I know that the next time you're going to speak to someone else, you're going to get that 100% correct? That's not what happens. I tell you a story, you take it on, it means something to you, you go and tell someone else these stories there, and then eventually 100, 200 years later, they go, right, we've got loads of different stories, we've got apocryphal gospels coming out of our posteriors, we've got all these competing claims, we've got to we've got to have some kind of uniformity here. So we're going to cut those ones out, we're going to cut those stories out, and we're going to have these, but it's kind of fairly arbitrary, and it's a very human process and doesn't have a lot to do with historical truth.
Yeah. All right, then. I really enjoyed this talk. And I would like to have you come back again at some point if you would.
Absolutely, Jake. Really,
Yeah.
really appreciate you offering me on. And sorry, I have a tendency to just like blah and talk. So
Oh
thank
no,
you.
oh no, I love it when somebody talks like that, because I mean I make sure to ask my questions, and I make sure my questions aren't too long, uh, because I like to have long answers. I like discussions like that. I don't. I try. I try not to be the one that. I try not to equally talk, because I just. If you get my point of view, I think it would be kind of strange, because like, okay, if I'm talking most of the time, the other guest isn't talking, what's going on? Very, very much so. I try to make sure I do it kind of like that, because to me that's more balanced.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. I'm going to drink my evidence.
Yep. All right, everybody. Make sure you check out the links to his Amazon page in the description. He's got plenty of books out there. Go check them out. I do recommend his book, Resurrection: A Critical Examination. It's a really good book. Remember, it's on Kindle, and as he's showing there, it's on paperback too. Or you can do both. Well, thanks for joining me, Jonathan Pearce.
Thank you, Jacob. Always a pleasure. Never a chore. I say always, it's the first time, but I'm sure it
Right.
always will be a pleasure. Never a chore.
Oh, it will be. It certainly will be. Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.